Imagine this. The air is damp, the walls are slick, with centuries of mildew, and the faint flicker of a torch barely illuminates the stone corridor ahead. The silence is broken only by the echo of dripping water. Then, suddenly, the muffled cry of a prisoner cuts through the darkness. Welcome to the medieval dungeon, a place built not only to confine, but to terrify, humiliate, and break the human spirit. Most people today imagine medieval dungeons as grim movie sets. Rusty chains on the walls, iron doors, and skeletal prisoners wasting away in the dark. But the reality was far more disturbing. These underground chambers were not just holding cells. They were the very heart of medieval justice, power, and cruelty. The dungeon was where secrets were hidden, where rulers silenced dissent, and where torture was elevated to a terrifying science. And in this video, we are going to peel back the layers of myth and legend to uncover the horrific truth about medieval dungeons and torture chambers. From the iron cages that left prisoners dangling for days, to the suffocating oubliettes where people were dropped and left to rot, to the sinister devices that twisted, crushed, and tore the human body apart. We will step into the very shadows of history that many would prefer to forget. Before we begin this dark journey, I want to remind you, if you love exploring the shocking, hidden, and often terrifying corners of medieval history, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Past of Medieval, and hit the like button. Your support helps us keep digging deeper into these stories the world has long tried to bury. Now, let's step into the darkness. The first thing you must understand is that medieval dungeons were not just prisons. They were psychological weapons. Unlike the relatively organized prison systems of later centuries, medieval rulers often used dungeons as tools of fear. These places were deliberately designed to be miserable. Prisoners were often held in small, windowless cells where the only company was rats, filth, and despair. One of the most notorious types of dungeon was the oubliette, from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. The oubliette was exactly what the name suggests, a place where prisoners were thrown in and then forgotten. These narrow vertical shafts were carved into the ground or into castle walls. Prisoners would be lowered down or sometimes simply dropped inside, where they had no room to move, no light, and no hope of escape. They were left in the dark with little or no food until hunger, thirst, or madness claimed them. In some cases, the only way out was death, and even then their bodies were often left to rot in the pit, creating a hellish stench that would greet the next unfortunate soul. But not all dungeons were designed to kill immediately. Some were crafted to keep people alive, barely alive, long enough to extract information, confessions, or simply to send a brutal message. Medieval justice was as much about spectacle as it was about punishment. A prisoner's screams echoing through the stone halls served as a chilling reminder to anyone thinking of defying authority. And this is where torture chambers come into play, often connected to dungeons or hidden within castles. These rooms contained some of the most nightmarish inventions in human history. Devices like the rack, which stretched the body until joints popped from their sockets, or the Iron Maiden, a coffin-shaped sarcophagus lined with spikes. May sound like legend, but many of these tools were very real, and their purpose was not just to punish, but to break the mind and spirit completely. As we move deeper into this story, we'll uncover not only how these devices were used, but also who they were used on. From political prisoners and accused witches, to common thieves and sometimes even nobles who fell out of favor. Each device tells us something chilling about the society that created it. A world where fear was a currency, and suffering was a performance. So, let's descend further into the dungeon, where the walls themselves seem to whisper the agony of centuries. When we think about medieval torture devices, one of the most infamous that comes to mind is the rack. This contraption was deceptively simple in design, a wooden frame with rollers at each end, connected by ropes. The victim would be tied down, wrists to one end and ankles to the other. Then, slowly and deliberately, the ropes were tightened. The rollers would pull in opposite directions, stretching the body past its natural limits. Muscles tore, ligaments snapped, and joints popped from their sockets. The screams of those on the rack were not just cries of pain. They were the sound of the human body literally being pulled apart. The rack was not meant to kill instantly. In fact, its cruel brilliance lay in how it kept its victims alive while inflicting unimaginable agony. Prisoners would often pass out from the sheer pain, only to be revived with cold water or slaps to the face so the torture could continue. And the worst part, Many people would confess to crimes they never committed, simply to make the torment stop. But the rack was only the beginning. Some dungeons held a far more claustrophobic device, the Iron Maiden, shaped like a human coffin and lined with sharp spikes on the inside. This device would trap the victim upright. When closed, the spikes pierced into the flesh, not deep enough to kill instantly, but just enough to puncture the skin, cause bleeding, and create constant, excruciating pain. Victims would die slowly inside this metal coffin, suffocating, bleeding, or dehydrating in the dark. While the Iron Maiden has become a symbol of medieval cruelty, historians debate whether it was used as frequently as legend suggests. Yet, whether real or exaggerated, the very idea of it demonstrates the terrifying imagination of medieval tormentors. Another chilling method was the use of the strapetto. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and a rope was looped around their wrists. The rope was then pulled up, hoisting the person into the air by their bound arms. The sudden suspension would wrench the shoulders from their sockets, sometimes tearing muscles and ligaments. If that wasn't enough, executioners often added heavy weights to the victim's feet, intensifying the strain until the body gave way. And then, there was the Judas cradle, a device, as psychologically humiliating as it was, physically destructive. The victim was stripped naked and forced to sit on a pyramid-shaped wooden seat with a sharp point. Their weight would gradually drive the point into their body. The torture could last for hours or even days, causing immense pain, infection, and eventually death. Each of these devices was designed not only to harm the body, but to completely strip away a person's dignity. Imagine being locked in a dungeon, knowing that your captors had an entire arsenal of instruments waiting just for you. For prisoners, even the sight of these devices was often enough to force a confession. But what's even more shocking is that torture was often a public affair. In many cases, victims were displayed in the town square, sometimes locked in iron cages or subjected to devices like the breaking wheel, where their bodies were shattered bone by bone before the eyes of the crowd. For rulers and inquisitors, torture was theater. A grotesque performance meant to terrify the masses into submission. Behind the thick stone walls of dungeons and chambers, however, the reality was even darker. Many prisoners died not from the devices themselves, but from the squalid conditions of their cells. Disease, starvation, and filth were often just as deadly as the rack or the strapetto. In truth, medieval justice relied less on rehabilitation and more on fear, control, and spectacle. And this brings us to the most chilling realization. Dungeons were never just about punishing criminals. They were about power. Kings, queens, inquisitors, and even the church used these chambers to silence opposition, crush rebellion, and maintain absolute dominance. Torture was a message, and it was written in screams, blood, and broken bodies. But the question is, who ended up in these dungeons? Was it always criminals and traitors? Or did the medieval world sometimes throw the innocent into these pits of horror? That's exactly where we're heading next. When we imagine prisoners locked away in medieval dungeons, it's tempting to assume they were all hardened criminals, murderers, thieves, or traitors. But the truth is far more unsettling. Many of the people who ended up behind those iron doors were not guilty of any real crime at all. Take the case of accused witches. In many parts of medieval Europe, superstition and fear ruled daily life. A poor harvest, a strange illness, or even a sudden storm could all be blamed on witchcraft. And who was accused most often? Women, especially widows, healers, or simply those who lived alone on the fringes of society. Once accused, these women were dragged into dungeons where confessions were extracted through unimaginable torture. One method was the infamous swimming test. A suspected witch would be bound and thrown into water. If she sank and drowned, she was considered innocent. But if she floated, which was often inevitable due to bound limbs and clothing, she was declared guilty, hauled out, and sent back to the dungeon for further torment. Either way, it was a death sentence. Then there were heretics, men and women, whose only crime was questioning the authority of the church. In an age where religion and politics were inseparable, disagreeing with doctrine wasn't just blasphemy, it was treason. The Inquisition, in particular, turned dungeons into tools of fear. Heretics were chained in darkness, denied food, and subjected to devices like the rack until they renounced their beliefs. Ironically, many of these heretics were simply early thinkers, philosophers, or reformers whose ideas were centuries ahead of their time. But the church wasn't the only power that filled dungeons. Kings and rulers used them as weapons of political control. Rival nobles, suspected spies, or even outspoken peasants could vanish into a dungeon with no trial and no hope of release. Being imprisoned was often less about guilt and more about silencing opposition. One chilling example comes from the Tower of London, perhaps the most infamous dungeon of all. Beneath its towering walls, countless prisoners were locked away. From royal rivals to commoners accused of treason, some were executed quickly, while others languished in its cells for years, their names erased from history. The tower became a symbol of absolute authority, a place where whispers against the crown turned into screams behind stone walls. Even more disturbing, medieval dungeons didn't discriminate by age. Children were sometimes imprisoned alongside adults. In some cases, the children of traitors were held hostage to ensure their parents' obedience. Imagine being a child stripped from your family and thrown into a cold, damp cell, not for something you did, but for the crime of being born into the wrong family. And then, there were the everyday people. Peasants who owed debts, farmers accused of theft, or travelers caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. For them, a dungeon wasn't just a punishment, it was often a death sentence. With no wealth to buy their freedom, no allies to plead their case, and no voice against the ruling elite, they simply disappeared. What made all of this even more horrifying was the secrecy. Once a person was locked away, they ceased to exist in the eyes of the outside world. Families were left wondering what happened to their loved ones, while the prisoners themselves languished in darkness, often with no trial, no charges, and no hope. And yet, as terrifying as the prisoners' fates were, the dungeons themselves carried an even deeper horror. Because these weren't just prisons, they were carefully designed instruments of psychological and physical torment. From their architecture to their atmosphere, everything inside was meant to break the human spirit. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. The dark, suffocating environment of the medieval dungeon itself. What it looked like, smelled like, and felt like for those trapped inside. To understand the true horror of medieval dungeons, we have to step inside them. Picture it for a moment. Narrow stone passages carved beneath castles or fortresses, hidden away from the light of day. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the smell of rot, mold, and human waste. For prisoners, every breath was a reminder that they were buried alive. Most dungeons were not designed for comfort. In fact, they were barely designed for survival. Cells were small, often no larger than a closet, with ceilings so low that prisoners couldn't stand upright. Many cells lacked proper ventilation, leaving inmates gasping in stale air, surrounded by the stench of disease. Rats, lice, and fleas were constant companions, feeding on scraps of food and on the prisoners themselves. Light was a luxury. Some dungeons had no windows at all, plunging captives into total darkness for weeks, months, or even years. Imagine waking up and never knowing if it was night or day. That endless blackness slowly chipped away at the human mind, driving many to madness long before torture devices ever touched their bodies. And then there was the cold. Stone walls trapped the chill, especially in winter. Prisoners were often given no blankets, no straw bedding, sometimes not even clothing beyond the rags they were arrested in. Frostbite and hypothermia were common, a slow, cruel death that left bodies stiff and unrecognizable. Food was scarce, and what little was given was barely edible. Stale bread, moldy gruel, or water tainted with filth. Starvation was a weapon, used deliberately to weaken and humiliate prisoners. Malnutrition left their bodies frail, their immune systems shattered. Perfect conditions for diseases like dysentery, tuberculosis, and plague to spread unchecked. But perhaps the cruelest punishment of all was solitary confinement. Some prisoners were thrown into pits, literally deep holes in the ground, with no human contact at all. These pits could be so tight that a person couldn't even stretch their arms or legs. In some accounts, prisoners were lowered into these holes and left there until they died, their corpses rotting in the same space where they had once clung to life. For others, the torment wasn't isolation, but overcrowding. Dozens of prisoners might be packed into a single room, forced to sit shoulder to shoulder, pressed against walls slick with moisture, with no toilets. Human waste covered the floors, spreading illness and despair. Those who died inside were sometimes left for days before their bodies were removed, forcing the living to share space with the dead. And if the physical conditions weren't enough to break a person, the psychological warfare certainly was. Prisoners were often kept awake deliberately, disturbed at all hours, or told false promises of release, only to be tortured again the next day. Guards sometimes played mind games, whispering through the walls, making captives question whether they were hearing voices or going insane. Every part of the dungeon was designed to destroy hope. It wasn't just about holding prisoners, it was about making sure they never left the same person who entered. But remember, these horrors were only the setting. The real nightmare began when torture chambers came into play, because medieval rulers and inquisitors didn't just want to punish or imprison. They wanted to extract confessions, force obedience, and make examples of their victims in the most brutal ways imaginable. And so, lurking in the darkness, awaited the most infamous devices of medieval cruelty. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the Strappado, and many more. Each carefully engineered, not just to cause pain, but to stretch the limits of human endurance and shatter the soul. That is where we're heading next, the twisted world of medieval torture chambers, and the instruments of agony that became symbols of fear across all of Europe. Now that we've seen the horrific conditions of medieval dungeons, it's time to enter the torture chambers themselves. The spaces where the true nightmares unfolded. Unlike the cramped, filthy cells meant to break prisoners slowly, torture chambers were engineered for one purpose: pain. And here, medieval creativity took a terrifying turn. Rulers, inquisitors, and executioners devised tools so cruel that they almost seemed born from hell itself. Let's begin with perhaps the most infamous, the rack. Imagine a massive wooden frame with rollers at each end. The prisoner's wrists were tied to one roller, their ankles to the other. Slowly, methodically, the executioner turned the cranks, stretching the body further and further until joints popped, muscles tore, and bones dislocated. Prisoners often passed out from sheer agony, only to be revived with water and subjected to more stretching. Some were pulled so far apart that their limbs were permanently crippled or torn completely from their sockets. If the rack was brutal in its simplicity, the Iron Maiden was horrifying in its psychological impact. Despite its misleadingly feminine name, it was anything but gentle. Shaped like a standing coffin, its inside was lined with sharp spikes. Victims were forced inside, and when the doors closed, the spikes pierced their flesh. Not deeply enough to kill instantly, but enough to puncture the body everywhere. Blood loss, shock, and infection finished the job over hours, sometimes days. Scholars debate whether the Iron Maiden was as widely used as legend suggests, but its symbolic power terrified people across Europe. Next, we have the Strappado, a cruel method favored during the Inquisition. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope tied to their wrists. Then they were dropped suddenly, only to be stopped short before hitting the ground. The weight of their body wrenched their shoulders out of place, tearing tendons and muscles. Often the damage was so severe that arms became useless for the rest of their lives. And then there was the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. Prisoners were strapped to a massive wooden wheel, and their limbs were shattered with iron clubs or hammers. Bones protruded from skin, flesh tore open, and the wheel itself became a gruesome frame displaying their mangled bodies. Sometimes, the half-dead victim was left tied to the wheel in the open air, where crows and dogs slowly picked their remains apart. But not all torture devices were large and theatrical. Some were chillingly simple, like the thumbscrew, a small vise that crushed the fingers or toes. It seemed almost minor compared to larger machines, but the pain it inflicted was unbearable. With each turn of the screw, bones cracked and splintered. Victims often begged to confess even before their fingers were destroyed. Equally terrifying was the chair of torture, a metal seat covered in hundreds of sharp spikes. Victims were strapped down, unable to move, as the spikes pressed into their flesh. Sometimes, hot irons were placed beneath the chair, heating the metal until skin burned and bubbled while still being pierced. And let us not forget water torture. Some methods forced prisoners to drink until their stomachs swelled to bursting. Others dripped water slowly, drop by drop, onto the same spot of the forehead, a maddening rhythm that drove captives to the brink of insanity. Every device served a dual purpose: to inflict unbearable suffering and to instill fear in the wider population. Because torture wasn't always hidden in the dungeon. Sometimes it was brought out into public squares, where townsfolk were forced to watch. The message was clear: defy the authorities, the church, or the crown, and this would be your fate. But beyond the pain itself, what made medieval torture chambers truly dark was how they turned suffering into a spectacle of power. Executioners weren't just tormentors, they were performers, demonstrating the authority of rulers through the destruction of human flesh. And perhaps most disturbing of all, many of these torments weren't reserved for hardened criminals. They could be used on anyone accused of heresy, witchcraft, or even petty theft. Men, women, and sometimes even children felt the bite of these devices, guilty or not. Yet, as cruel as these machines were, they were only tools. The real terror lay in the mindset behind them, a world where pain was seen as justice, and fear was the ultimate weapon of control. So far, we've seen the iron teeth, the spikes, and the wheels of medieval torture chambers. But if you think the horror was limited to physical pain, think again. Some of the darkest scars left behind by these chambers were psychological. Imagine being dragged into a dungeon blindfolded, not knowing which device awaited you. Sometimes executioners didn't even have to use the tools, merely showing them could break a person's mind. Victims were paraded past racks, spiked chairs, and iron maidens told in gruesome detail how each worked. Many confessed instantly, their imaginations doing the torturer's work for them, and this was no accident. Torture wasn't just about extracting information. It was about control through fear. By creating an atmosphere where pain was inevitable, authorities ensured obedience, silence, and submission. The chamber itself became a psychological weapon. But perhaps the most chilling part was how religion justified it all. The medieval church often claimed that pain could purify the soul. Inquisitors argued that torture saved heretics from eternal damnation by forcing them to confess. A man's screams, echoing through a stone dungeon, weren't just signs of suffering, they were twisted into proof of divine justice. Take the witch trials of the late Middle Ages. Accused women, often poor and defenseless, were tortured until they confessed to impossible crimes. Flying on broomsticks, consorting with demons, or poisoning cattle with spells. The torture itself was considered righteous, a way of exposing Satan's servants. Once they confessed, truthfully or not, they were often executed, completing the cycle of fear. But it wasn't only the church. Kings and nobles embraced torture too. By using it as punishment or interrogation, they reinforced their absolute power. Torture chambers became political tools, silencing dissenters, rebels, and rivals. And here lies one of the darkest truths. Torture was often less about finding the truth and more about enforcing obedience. A confession under torture might be worthless, but the spectacle of breaking someone's will was priceless for those in power. Yet, even in this brutal age, cracks began to show. Some medieval scholars, lawyers, and even clerics started questioning whether torture truly served justice. They noticed how confessions gained under pain were unreliable. They saw the cruelty, the madness, and the corruption it bred. By the late Middle Ages, whispers of doubt were spreading. Philosophers began to argue that true justice couldn't be built on screams and broken bones. Still, it would take centuries before torture chambers were truly abandoned. The shadow of the dungeon lingered well into the Renaissance and beyond. But what makes these stories so haunting is how ordinary they became. For medieval rulers and inquisitors, torture wasn't monstrous. It was normal. It was law. And that chilling normalization of cruelty is what makes this chapter of history so terrifying. Because the real horror isn't just the devices or the chambers themselves. It's the reminder that humans, given power and justification, can make pain into a system. And once it becomes a system, it can last for generations. The further we explore the shadowy world of medieval dungeons, the more it becomes clear that these were not merely rooms filled with iron chains and crude devices. They were carefully engineered theaters of terror, where every sound, every flicker of torchlight, every echoing scream served a purpose far greater than punishment alone. Torture was not only about breaking the body, it was about breaking the soul long before a single wound was inflicted. Instead, they would be left to rot in a cell, often in complete darkness, surrounded by the muffled cries of other prisoners or the groans of the condemned. They could hear the clanging of chains, the steady dripping of water, the scurrying of rats. Days might pass with nothing but silence and shadows for company. The imagination, in such conditions, quickly became its own torturer. Many prisoners began confessing to imagined crimes out of sheer desperation, long before any iron spike touched their skin. The prisoner would be led, trembling, past the arsenal of the chamber. The rack, with its cruel pulleys, the jailer would describe, in cold and clinical detail, exactly what each device did, and how long the victim would last before they succumbed. For many, this was enough to shatter their will. The human mind, after all, can create torments even worse than reality. Executioners themselves played a key role in this theater. Cloaked in hoods or masks, they became less than human, agents of the state, or of God, depending on the rhetoric of the day. Some even cultivated reputations. Their very names whispered with terror in villages and towns. When such men entered the chamber, their presence alone was often as effective as any device. A raised eyebrow, a cold word, a hand casually running along the edge of a blade. These gestures could make even the bravest falter. But what is perhaps most chilling is that torture was not always conducted in secrecy. While dungeons themselves were shrouded in darkness, there were occasions when the torments within became spectacles for the privileged. Nobles, clergy, or wealthy citizens might be granted access to watch an interrogation unfold, turning human suffering into a form of grim entertainment. To see a heretic scream, to watch a thief beg for mercy. It reinforced not only the might of authority, but also the gulf between the rulers and the ruled. The medieval mind did not see torture purely as cruelty for its own sake, though. To them, it was often justified as a tool of truth. The logic, twisted though it was, claimed that pain stripped away lies. The soul, they believed, could not withstand agony and deception simultaneously. Under torment, a man would finally reveal what he had hidden, whether it was a stolen coin, a forbidden faith, or a plot against a lord. Yet, as we know today, pain does not bring truth, it brings desperation. Many confessed to crimes they had never committed, weaving fantastical tales of witchcraft, heresy, or treason simply to make the torment stop. Entire trials were built on these confessions, condemning the innocent while sparing the guilty who managed to evade the dungeon's grasp. And it wasn't only the prisoners who were changed by the dungeon. The torturers themselves, steeped daily in cruelty, became desensitized to suffering. Some grew sadistic, delighting in their work. There are whispers and chronicles of executioners haunted by nightmares, of men who drank heavily just to face another day in the chamber. In this sense, the dungeon corrupted not only its victims, but also its keepers. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way the dungeon extended beyond its walls. Tales of what happened inside, the screams, the instruments, the hopelessness, spread quickly through towns and villages, and reminders to adults that defiance came at an unbearable cost. Even those who never saw the inside of a dungeon lived in its shadow, their obedience bought with the threat of the torments they had heard described. The dungeon was not just a place, it was a presence, a looming specter of control over medieval life. In this way, the medieval dungeon was more than a prison, more than a torture chamber. It was a psychological weapon wielded by rulers, churches, and inquisitors alike. Every scream that echoed from its depths was a message to the world above. Resist, and this will be your fate. And often, that message was more powerful than any chain or any blade. As the centuries moved forward, many medieval torture chambers became more than just tools of oppression. They became symbols of absolute power, terrifying reminders of what awaited anyone who dared to challenge kings, queens, or the church. Take the Château de Chillon in Switzerland. Beneath its grand halls, prisoners were shackled to walls overlooking the freezing waters of Lake Geneva. The damp, dark cells were designed not just to restrain, but to break the spirit. When travelers passed the castle, they knew what happened inside. The walls themselves whispered of human misery. In Spain, the Inquisition's prisons were deliberately crafted to instill fear. Rumors spread of underground cells where victims heard the screams of others, but never saw the light of day again. The secrecy surrounding these dungeons amplified their terror. No one really knew what was happening, only that it was worse than imagination. And then, there were chambers that transcended history, entering into legend. The oubliette, for example, a pit-like dungeon whose very name comes from the French word oubliette, meaning to forget. Prisoners tossed into these holes were left to starve in darkness, their existence erased. Whether or not every castle had an oubliette, the concept itself haunted the medieval imagination. But the legacy of these chambers didn't stop in the Middle Ages. Even today, when you walk into preserved castles or ruins across Europe, guides often linger on the stories of the dungeon. Tourists peer into the deep pits and stare at the rusted manacles. It's almost as if these rooms refuse to let their memory die. Writers and artists of later centuries amplified their myth. Gothic literature in the 18th and 19th centuries resurrected these chambers as backdrops of terror. Edgar Allan Poe's tale, The Pit and the Pendulum, drew directly on imagery from medieval dungeons. The suffocating darkness, the iron devices, the sense of being trapped with no hope of escape. Even modern cinema, from horror films to historical dramas, continues to borrow from this imagery. The dripping stone walls, the hooded torturer, the iron door clanging shut. The medieval dungeon has become a universal symbol of cruelty, and here lies the unsettling truth. While these chambers belong to the past, their echoes reach into the present. Because history shows us how easily cruelty can be normalized when it is given a mask of law or religion. When we look back at medieval torture, we're not just peering into a world of superstition and brutality. We're staring into a mirror, one that reflects the dangers of unchecked power, fear-driven justice, and the human capacity to justify almost anything in the name of order. The stones of those dungeons may be cold now, their chains rusted and silent, but the lessons they carry are still burning. So, what do medieval dungeons and torture chambers ultimately tell us about the Middle Ages? They reveal a world where fear was the strongest weapon. Monarchs, inquisitors, and lords knew that pain could silence dissent, but the fear of pain could control entire kingdoms. A dungeon didn't need to be filled with prisoners every day. Its very existence whispered a threat into the hearts of the people. But perhaps the darkest truth is this. Torture chambers weren't just places of cruelty. They were carefully crafted theaters of power. Every scream, every drop of blood, every set of shackles reminded witnesses that the rulers of the land could control not just your body, but your very soul. And yet, centuries later, these same chambers have become something else entirely. Today, they are tourist attractions, points of morbid fascination. We walk through them with cameras, marveling at the horrors of the past, almost forgetting that real flesh and blood once suffered here. The terror has become spectacle, and perhaps that too says something about humanity. So the next time you hear about a dungeon or pass by the ruins of a castle, ask yourself, was it just a prison, or was it a stage for one of the darkest performances in human history, where power, fear, and pain merged into something unforgettable? Because in the end, medieval torture chambers were not built to destroy the body. They were built to haunt the mind forever. If you found this glimpse into the shadows of history fascinating, don't forget to subscribe to Past of Medieval, where we uncover the strangest, darkest, and most chilling truths from the Middle Ages. And remember, history is never just in the past. Sometimes, it's closer than you think.